Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. A quote from the Buddha, echoed by Jack Kornfield in this wonderful episode of Heart Wisdom 262, The Liberated Heart, Shifting from Trauma to Loving Awareness, with Dr. Thomas Hübl. This is the second part of last week's episode, all about the collective and individual healing of trauma. Jack falls into quite a flow in this one, sharing some amazing stories of his time with the Cambodian meditation master Maha Ghosananda, sharing how we can use meditation to help wake us from the autopilot that we generally find ourselves in our daily life, and how we can stop identifying with our traumas and begin identifying with mindful, loving awareness. And he so sweetly wraps this up in how we can take this mindful, loving awareness and bring it to the world as a true form of activism, and how in that activism we can stay fresh and balanced rather than burning out. If you are engaged in the world or want to be engaged more internally in figuring out how we can relieve ourselves of the traumas, the sufferings that have been embedded so intensely within our beings, this is the episode for you. So Thomas Hübl, who so eloquently opens Jack up with his questions, is a world-renowned teacher, author, and international facilitator who works with the complexity of systems and cultural change by integrating core wisdom traditions and mysticism with discoveries of science. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to thomashübl.com. The link is in the show notes, and I highly recommend you checking out his offerings and the summits which he puts on each year in order to tackle these great questions. Other than that, we have an amazing live cohort going on for the Power of Forgiveness journey, which Jack is doing online with students. It is not too late to sign up for that, no matter when you are listening. These courses are built to be taken at any time by anyone, so we hope you open the door to forgiveness whenever that feels ripe in your life. Then on November 2nd, if you are listening chronologically and in time, Jack will be doing a day-long live stream, How to Steady the Heart, Mindfulness, Love, and Wisdom Amidst Wild Times. This is presented by Spirit Rock, and like I said last week, I've been joining in for these day-longs just to really steep one of my weekend days in wisdom, mindfulness, and love. And it has been such a cozy addition to life, which has been very fast for me, and I'm sure it's been very fast for all of you. So I welcome you into this amazing online Spirit Rock live stream on November 2nd. It's a day long with Jack and sure to be a real treat. Other than that, I implore you to sign up for Jack's newsletter at jackkornfield.com/newsletter, where you will have free offerings such as articles, Dharma talks, meditations delivered to your inbox, as well as information and deals on upcoming courses for more in-depth learning experiences with Jack. But for now, I invite you into this wonderful video podcast. If you would like to, please put it up on your television or your projector and enjoy the visual transmission as well of episode 262, The Liberated Heart, Shifting from Trauma to Loving Awareness, with Dr. Thomas Hübl and Jack Kornfield. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you help others through the authenticity of your being, and may your heart be smiling. Namaste.
I lived in one of the monasteries with a monk who became very famous. He became the head of Cambodian Buddhism and nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize a number of times. His name was Maha Ghosananda. And he spoke 12 languages, and it was extraordinary. Mostly he was just a sweet, kind human being, kind of an ocean of love. And we were in the monasteries when the Khmer Rouge had taken over Cambodia and killed a quarter of the population, a kind of genocide. 2 million or more people killed in the killing fields. And because he wasn't there, all 19 members of his family plus were killed, his temple burned, the village destroyed. So we went to the refugee camps. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees who'd fled into Thailand, taken care of by the UNHCR. And Maha Ghosananda said, let's see if we can set up a temple for these people, and got permission from the UN. Just a tin roof and a platform and an altar with a Buddha image on it, as you would have in a temple, in the center ground at some point. And then we went through the camps ringing a big gong to open it. But the Khmer Rouge underground, which was there in the camp, said, anybody who goes, when you get back to Cambodia, you'll be killed. So we didn't know if anyone would come. And the bells rung through the camp. And out of the, 80,000 people in that camp, 25,000 people poured into the center square. Huge number. And all sat. And then here's this one monk, Maha Ghosananda, sitting up there, looking out. And it was the faces of trauma of a grandmother with 2 surviving grandchildren out of 8, or an uncle and a couple of little boys with him, or a parent who'd lost their partner in their village. And you could just see the visible trauma on the shell shock, to use a war metaphor. And I thought, all right, what will Maha Ghosananda say to these people? And he put his hands together, gazed at them, and he began to chant in Khmer or Cambodian and in Sanskrit, Pali, this verse, one of the very first verses of the Buddhist text, that goes, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. And he chanted it in Cambodian and in Pali again and again. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. And pretty soon people started to chant it with him. They hadn't heard these prayers for some years because the temples were burned and they would have been killed reciting them. And tears started to stream down their face. And he continued to recite them. And it was as if he spoke a truth that was even bigger than their sorrows. That this is the ancient eternal law, that hatred never ends by hatred. And after that, for 15 years, he led these refugees back to their villages once the war died down some. And he said, you can't go back in a bus. You can't go back in, the back of a truck or something like that. He said, you have to reclaim your land and your place with your heart and your step. So he knew the embodied physicalness of healing. And so at the front of a line of 1,000 refugees, some of them barefoot, he'd be ringing a bell chanting, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. And they would walk through the killing fields or by the minefields and so forth, back for 100 miles to their village, chanting the chant of loving kindness till they reclaimed the land and then somehow reclaimed their right to be on it in a different way. So the whole notion that spiritual practice doesn't have anything to do with activism is a fiction. And as you point out, there are the 2 different ways that we can fall off the middle path, and we all do. One is that you become so focused on your individual meditation, and then you use it as a kind of spiritual bypass, say, and that's really common because so many traumatized people are drawn to meditation for healing. And then they have experiences of rising above the pain, of transcendence, of great love, and so forth, without actually dealing with it. And it's still there in their body, or it can get activated as mine was. So there's that, the bypass, and easy to do for a while. And because we all, as I do, have one of our defenses is a defense of denial, or moving away from things that are too painful. And it serves us. It's not all bad. All these defenses have a good purpose, as you know. On the other hand, there are people who get riled. I'll never let this happen again, and they become activists. We've had generations of burned out activists come to our retreats because what was fueling them was not what supported Maha Ghosananda in his work, but it was bitterness and anger and unresolved trauma. And I know, working in refugee camps as I have, that half the people who work there are people who had tremendous trauma themselves. And they feel like, okay, now I'm with my people. I'm with the other traumatized people. But they haven't necessarily found the inner skills to heal it so well. They feel better because they can respond and make something happen and help people. Hallelujah, it's fantastic. But in fact, as a human being, we have a sacred, dimension of who we really are, which is consciousness that's born into these bodies, a timeless consciousness that contains and is everything. And we have this mystery of our individual incarnation, in which we have to pay our taxes and drive on the correct side of the street. And anybody who says, I'm really spiritual and I don't have to bother with that, see what happens the next time you don't stop at a red light. You realize that you have to wed together the personal and the collective and the human incarnation on this earth with all the other creatures. You're woven with every breath you take is the breath of the starlings and the breath of the earthworms in the soil. We're all interbreathing it together. That's how it works. That's what life is. So we have all of this. And in the long term, you can go one way or the other. You get an activist phase in your life, or time when you go alone into the woods for a year, or you do something. All of that's good. What it can bring you back to, if you have a wise tradition or teacher or understanding, is that they're not separate. And that, yes, as I said, here in the U.S., where I mostly teach, although I've taught all around the world, we're Americans. We know how to misuse anything. So we can misuse meditation. We can misuse activism. And that's really because the misuse is the clinging to transcend some kind of false transcendence, where there's this visionary, beautiful opening. But, what about how you put on your shoes and care for the children in your neighborhood, or in your family? We're also called in different ways, Thomas. Some people are truly called to live in a cave. And sure, there might be some denial or some bypass, but I'm thankful for those hermits in the caves that are doing 24/7 prayers for the world. And because I grew up in a very well-educated scientific family, and my twin brother was a PhD professor scientist. Another brother is an engineer and architect and helps run the city of San Francisco and emergency services, all kinds of things. Another brother was the director of the biggest biotech company in the world. My father is a scientist. So for a while, I didn't believe in all this mystical stuff. You like to use the word mystical, so I'll go with your language for a little bit. There's a lot I didn't believe in. They talk about the ghosts and spirits in the monastery where I live, because there's a great deal of fear in some of those cultures of spirits and ghosts of the dead. And I said, where are they? Where's the charnel ground? We used to go and sit and make prayers in the charnel. I'm going to sit there alone at night and say, okay, you show me. Come on, you damn ghosts. Because I was, I was full of myself. And I was a young American, like, okay, come on, this is just okay. I did. There's a lot of things I didn't used to believe in. Now, I pretty much believe in everything. And that's partly because it's all created by consciousness. So, of course, it's possible. And so many stories and experiences I've had of being halfway around the world and knowing somebody died. Nobody even told me, and there was nothing, and they had an accident. It wasn't like they were sick. And I know this. And I call it, yeah, they died. How could that be? How could it be? It could be only because we are consciousness itself. We're connected in that way. Or I sit with people who are dying and, they say nothing happens, and then, they have a near-death experience and they come back for a little bit anyway. Well, what happened? Well, I floated on my body. There was light. Do you see anybody? Maybe, maybe not, and so forth. You thought you would die, and it's like turning the light switch off, and there's nothing there, but big surprise. And of course, I've had lots of out-of-body experiences and all kinds of other past life experiences. So I used to not believe in anything. Now I pretty much believe in everything. Anyway, one more story to tell you of a different kind. And this has to do with the collective, and then we'll go maybe back more to the individual. One of the senior people trained by Peter Levine in his somatic experience trauma work is an Israeli-American, a woman, quite skilled. And she's decided to go back to Israel and Palestine to do help in some way, because a lot of what's happening there, and I've done some peace work both in Israel and Palestine, is really the result of generational trauma. The Holocaust for sure, but it's not just that. It's the million Israelis who came from Russia who were traumatized under the communist regime and became kind of right-wing, paranoid. If you lived in Russia, you'd be paranoid too, or you should be, et cetera. But what's happened, of course, is that with that unhealed trauma, they, not all, but those who are unhealed then are on this alarm, fight, flight, or freeze, where safety is the only channel that matters. And so they can mistreat the Palestinians who have their own generational trauma. And it's a reenactment of unhealed trauma from one side to the other and the other side back, and so forth. So I thought, okay, cool. This woman is going to go and do trauma work. Maybe she'll work with the military, maybe she'll work with children. You know who she worked with first? Journalists. And I said, why did you do that? She said, because if you're a journalist in a war zone, and honestly, at times, Israel and Palestine, Gaza, they become war zones. And you see missiles, you see people being shot, you see people throwing Molotov cocktails, you see the violence in both directions. You get traumatized. And if you don't have a way to digest or release that trauma, then everything that you write and broadcast after that has the flavor of alarm and trauma, and it makes the whole system worse. It makes sense to you?
Absolutely.
So therefore, the frontline people, like the journalists, need to have a way to digest and come back to an equilibrium where they can not only experience and see the things that are traumatic, but also have a sense that they're bigger than that trauma and invite people into a wiser perspective. And this is where the individual work becomes absolutely critical. So now we're going to shift to a different octave or a different level. The deepest understanding that comes in healing trauma goes beyond the body and the emotions and the words, all of which need to be respected, to the freedom and the recognition, not as a bypass, but as a reality, that who you are is not your trauma, that who you are is so much more than your trauma. The Thomas Merton, the Christian mystic, said, I could see the secret beauty behind the eyes of every human being, that sacred light that was born in, the child of the spirit that was born into every one of these bodies and that will leave it. And that's who you are. That's who we are, is consciousness. And my teacher, Ajahn Chah, talked about it. He used the non-dual language of becoming the knowing, the one who knows, the witness to it all, with great compassion, with mindful, loving awareness, to see the dance of life, the praise and blame and gain and loss and the seasons of the Tao, to tend them, to plant beautiful seeds, to water what we want to happen, because that's also true. And to remember that it's so much bigger than our ideas and our small identity and who we think we are and how it should be, that who we are actually is the consciousness itself. And knowing this not as some nice idea that you read in a spiritual book or hear even, but having the profound experience that this body isn't who you are, that your emotions are not what you are. God knows you're not your thoughts. At least I hope for your own benefit you don't believe them all, that who you are is consciousness itself, manifesting in this remarkable way as both the universal and the personal incarnate experience. And that's what liberates. But it liberates not in order to remove yourself from the world, but to see the sacred shining in every leaf and dewdrop. It said when the eyes and the heart are open, the leaves and the trees become like pages in the holy books, that everything is imbued with a sense of the sacred, because that's what it is. And what we are is love, loving awareness, love. The first gesture when a child is born is to hold them with love, unless there's some terrible trauma happening. And at the end of life, as somebody's departing and leaving, you hold their hand, and you're there with them. What matters at the end? Almost nothing except love. And in between, we get to love and do our dance.
That's very beautiful. It leaves a lot of silence. Yeah, very beautiful. In fact, this was a beautiful kind of download of what really matters.
Yeah, an outpouring of words. Let them wash through you, people who are listening. Come back as Thomas invites you to the silence. Yeah. Now, what's beautiful about individual meditation, it has different dimensions to it. First is you just really get to pay more attention to your life, because otherwise we can be going along on automatic pilot, disconnected from our bodies. That line from James Joyce where he wrote, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. Somehow on automatic pilot, especially in modern, speedy consumer society where we're checking our devices and keeping our schedules and being busy and so forth, what matters to us can get lost. What we care about, being able to look in the eyes of the person that you're meeting and listen to the rhythm of their life as they meet you in your office or on the street, post-pandemic, if you're able, or wherever it is, and realize that we're in it together, that there's some deep way of seeing that secret beauty in another. So we need that. And what individual meditation then does is first, it cultivates the capacity of attention so that we can attend to our own bodies, that we can know what we feel. And half of what happens on retreats or in psychotherapy at certain points is people start to get a vocabulary of emotions that they didn't have. What do you feel? I don't feel much. Okay. Well, not feeling much is called numbness. What does that feel like? Well, I hate that you call it that. Okay, now you're feeling a little bit of annoyance. Okay, what does that feel like? I wish you'd stop bothering me. Okay, there's wishing. Okay, notice what that feels like. And they start to realize, oh, there's this whole stream of feelings that are there. So you get to be with your body, you get to be with your emotions, you start to see all the stories. And people who've never done a silent retreat of 10 days or longer, you sit and you realize that the mind has no governor on it. And it just, it secretes stories the way the salivary gland secretes saliva. And it's not in your control. There are practices where you can stop your thoughts for a bit, just like you can hold your breath, but they come back. And the point isn't to not have emotions or not have your body breathe or not have your mind secrete thoughts. But it's first to notice what's happening. So become the loving witness of it all, the loving awareness. And then secondly, to notice where you get entangled and caught, what causes the unnecessary suffering. We have pain, that's part of it. We age, we get sick, that's part of being human. But our fear, our grasping, the stories we tell, our resentments, our anxiety and so forth, as Mark Twain aptly put, my life has been filled with terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened, right? We can spin out all these stories, and fear is primarily a story of what's yet to come. In the moment, it might be painful or difficult, but fear is almost always connected with some story that we tell about what's going to come next. So when you've learned to meditate, you're able to, you do what the neuroscientists call expanding the window of tolerance. That's Dr. Dan Siegel's expression, so that you can tolerate your emotions, the level of your grief or sadness for things that you've lost, or longing or hope or fear or whatever, that you become comfortable with the whole domain of emotion. You can tolerate physical pain and tingling and itching, part of the Zen training. You sit and you don't move, not because not moving is a spiritual thing, but because you learn to be bigger than the reactions to everything going on in your body. You find a different kind of freedom. And then you start to see all the stories the mind tells and all the beliefs and how you identify with all of them. And then the big shift in meditation isn't so much that the things go away, although they can at times, and quiet and become silent and connected and oneness and transcendence. The big shift is the shift of identity, that you don't take yourself to be that personality. You get amused by it. You don't take yourself to be the trauma. You heal it as you can. You feel compassionate for it. It awakes your tenderness for everybody else that's been traumatized like that. But it's not who you are. And that greater and greater freedom of being the loving awareness itself, that's the liberation, more than any state. And I know when I came back to see my teacher, Ajahn Chah, after going and practicing in this Burmese monastery, and I was silent for almost a year and a half, except for 15 minutes to speak with a teacher a couple times a week. Other than that, silent. And I had all these, dissolve my body into light, out of the body floating experiences, and experience of deep insight and transcendence. And I came back and I told him about all this stuff. He smiled. He said, "Yeah, you had quite a retreat." I said, "Yeah." He looked at me and he said, "Something else to let go of, huh?" And that was his main response, because he wasn't interested in any particular experience. He was interested in inviting us into the liberated heart that's not based on any kind of experience, however wild or transcendent or tender it might be, but to become the one who knows, the witness, the loving awareness itself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful also to feel your transmission as you speak. Very beautiful.
Let's talk about activism for a minute or 10.
Right.
Climate change. I'm on the board of Paul Hawkins' organization Regeneration, and hopefully you've seen his prior book, Drawdown, How to Reverse Climate Change in One Generation. These two, not only books, but he's been meeting with the heads of the EU Parliament and Congress and the CEOs of the biggest multinationals and so forth to try to show what's possible. We need to be activists, unless you're going to sit in a cave, which is its own thing. But as you're engaged in the world, because we care about it, our children, our grandchildren, our nieces and nephews, our community, the porcupines and ravens that live in the trees around us, the sparrows and the grasshoppers and the crickets that liven up our evenings. We're all in this together. Now, there are different ways to approach it. I'm saying, all right, I want to do something. You can approach it out of fear. You can approach it out of anger. My good friend Wes Nisker, colleagues who went to speak with Gary Snyder about this. Gary Snyder is now probably in 90 or so, and maybe late 80s. He wrote Earth Household 50 years ago or more as one of our first great environmentalists. I got the Pulitzer Prize as a poet and as an environmentalist. And he said, Gary, rising seas, loss of species, heat domes, population destruction. What advice do you have for us now as a voice for the climate and the biological world now for half a century? Gary looked back and he said, don't feel guilty. If you try to save it because you're guilty or because you're angry or you're bitter and so forth, those are the very forces that made the problem. If you're going to save it, and even that's kind of hubris, if you're going to help, save it because you love it. It's the only force that's big enough to reverse this. It's like the mothers who pick cars off their children. There's a power that we have to draw on, that's love for one another and for this earth, that will make the real difference. And anything else becomes an activism that also adds to the polarization of it all. So how do we bring these worlds together? The inner world, where you learn to tolerate the 100,000 emotions and thoughts and physical experiences that make up your incarnation, with graciousness, with loving awareness, with tenderness and appreciation. And a lot of the meditations I teach these days, as people pay attention to body, heart, and mind, I end by saying, bow to each one and say, thank you. Thank you to body for caring so much. Oh, thank you to my poor heart, all the fears and anxieties. And thank you for holding so much. I'm okay now. And then to your mind, oh my God, thank you for trying to keep me safe and plan and remember and strategize. I'm actually okay. Thank you. Thank you. But there's a kind of gratitude to all of it, including all of the useful defenses that we have to keep us going. But then if we want to make a difference, which I think in our heart we all do in some fashion, if we get quiet and listen to the voices of the world and the children and the beings and the creatures we share it with. As Chief Seattle said, if all the beasts were gone, men would surely die of great loneliness of spirit. For what happens to the beasts happens to man, he wrote in that, or said in that ancient language. So we need to do it for our heart's sake, because we are them. But there's a different way to do it. And that's the power of love. And then you start to see, there's a book that's coming out this fall. I just did a program to help with it from Jane Goodall, who's almost 90 herself, called The Book of Hope with Doug Abrams. And she sees the environmental destruction and the loss of habitat that these beings, her brothers and sisters, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, these are our people. And she talks about what it means to carry hope. And I know it. If I go in a refugee camp, they don't want me to come in depressed or outraged and angry and, all upset. They actually want somebody to bring a sense of joy and well-being and uplift and say, here's what's possible. Because you come from 1,000 generations of survivors. We know how to do this. We know how to turn things around. And now in this time, pandemic and global climate change and so forth, we're called upon to do it again. And we can. And the same is true for racism, which I see as the central wound in the American culture, certainly in the US. Underlying the economic injustice and underlying education problems, and underlying so many things is this long history of racism that's still so present, in which we actually see here's this little child born, hey, I'm here. Well, I'm sorry, your eyes are the wrong color, or your skin is this weird color. You're a lesser person. You don't count. You're not as good as our kind of person. And this goes back to very early primitive wiring in us that we're in the cave, and are the ones in the caves over there are going to steal our food, kill us, take our children or wives or whatever. There's a kind of very deep survival brain. Fortunately, that's not the only brain we have. We have the survival brain, we have the emotional brain, but we also have this spiritual dimension, this capacity to know who we are in a much bigger way. And so racism, because it's so embedded, not just in American culture, but in its own way everywhere I've been. There's racism in Japan toward the Koreans, toward the Africans. There's racism in India, the lighter to the darker, there's, name it. In Brazil, wherever you go, you can find it, or pretty much. And colorism. And then caste, which is a whole other, who's on top. A lot of it's around power and who gets the resources. How we approach it. The need for collective healing, which first means to honor the suffering. Trauma doesn't get healed unless the grief and the suffering is actually honored. And then it's not an individual honoring, but it's a collective honoring, as your work shows. And then in that, there's the individual transcendence, forgiveness, compassion, all the different dimensions of consciousness that we can call upon to shift us from being either the victim or the perpetrator. And I'll tell you another story. So I was doing a climate summit, and the person I was in dialogue with was Cristina Figuera, who is a Costa Rican diplomat who was the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Change, who helped organize the Rio Summit and then pulled together the Paris Climate Accord. Quite a remarkable woman. And she talked about how, as she was working on the Paris Climate Accord, she got more and more depressed and more stuck because countries were intransigent and grasping and aggressive and didn't want to come together, and everybody had their own agenda, and it just felt more and more the power of greed and grasping and hatred, and really of separation of what's good for me and not what's good for us. And then somebody said, seeing her getting more lost and depressed, there's a place, she was in, I think in Geneva or somewhere in Switzerland, There's a place in southern France called Plum Village with this Vietnamese teacher. His name is Thich Nhat Hanh. She'd never heard of it. Maybe you should go there for a little retreat. So she went, as she described. And as she listened to Thich Nhat Hanh's simple and profound teachings that we carry it all within us. I am the child thrown into the sea by the sea pirate, and I am the pirate too. I have all this in me. As she listened to the teachings of interdependence, as she learned the tools which meditation brings of quieting the mind and tending the heart and all its grief with compassion, and how to be present for this human incarnation with its 10,000 joys and sorrows. She said she had a revelation that the problem with the climate change summit in Paris is that it was being divided into perpetrators and victims, who was doing what to whom, and a tremendous amount of blame and resentment and resistance. And when she shifted her consciousness with her meditation and the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, she said, oh, this is a family. These are the different parts of our family. We're brothers and sisters. We're woven together in this. And her heart somehow got released from that struggle. And she went back and got 195 countries to come together and sign on the Paris Climate Accord. So when we talk about activism, the individual and the collective, they can't be separated. We have to go to the wellspring of wisdom and do some of our own healing work so that our activism actually comes from the place like Maha Ghosananda that can lead people out of tremendous trauma and suffering back to, at least in the direction of well-being.
Jack, that's amazing. We're coming to the end of our time, but I want to tell you that I really love the depth of your sharing, and also how you weave stories into the teaching. It's very beautiful. It creates a very strong space of the transmission of what you talk about, and also, connects it to real life. So it's very beautiful. I think that was a great journey that you went on touching on many important aspects of collective healing, and I'm very happy that you join us. I feel very deeply nourished and touched and inspired by your sharing, and I'm sure many people who listen right now too. And yeah, I want to thank you for this contribution. If there's anything else, anything that you want to leave our listeners with, please go ahead. And
a few simple things. First, and I commend Jane Goodall's Book of Hope. Everything is possible. Maybe not immediately, and maybe not the way you think of it, but the very seeds that you plant and the very seeds that you water are what will create the future. The human spirit is incredibly creative. We've survived so much. And within you is that child of the spirit, inviolable, that used to tickle and run around and love and see the mystery of life. That's still in you. It's actually who you are. So take time to quiet your mind, meditate, open your heart, walk in the trees, listen to the voices of the non-human brothers and sisters, as well as all of those things. Cultivate loving kindness.